Dr. Spock, somebody should have taken a better rod to him. Every child is different. Every child needs a different kind of discipline. You don't have to spank or strike, do any kind of corporal punishment for every child. And you don't have to do it all the time with any child. But there is a time for corporal punishment at some point in the life of almost every child. You can't reason with, a 3 or 4-year-old. They just don't have the life experience or the intellectual capacity to be able to understand cause and effect, and how what they're doing today is going to have this cascade of effects in the rest of their life. And they don't have the ability to create the good habits based on knowing what's right and wrong. So sometimes you have to do something to them that helps them learn on their level, that creates the habit for them. You don't touch a hot stove. Well, you can let the child learn for himself, which could have permanent life-altering consequences, or you could smack his hand when he's reaching for the stove and teach him that touching a hot stove hurts without it doing permanent damage. But if you take his hand away, like pull his hand away, and then you talk to him about it, I'm sure that there is some child out there where that is actually a useful strategy. I'm not sure that I've ever met him. At a certain age, of course, that works, but, you got a lot of years between being born and that age where you can reason with the child to explain that a hot stove is hot and it's going to hurt. So sometimes you have to give a little bit of pain to avoid a much bigger pain. And that's really what this is saying. Whoever spares the rod hates his son. Now, the word for hate in Hebrew, in the scriptures, it can mean, a really intense emotional reaction, like an intense emotional dislike of something. But that's not the primary meaning. The primary meaning is doing bad, unpleasant things to somebody. So like when God says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, that doesn't mean that God had a visceral dislike for Esau. It meant that he did unpleasant things to Esau and he did pleasant things for Jacob. And of course, not all the time. Esau got his rewards and Jacob got his punishments too. It was just on the whole.
That is true.
And so when it says that sparing the rod whoever spares the rod hates his son, you could also read this as whoever spares the rod is hurting his son. So you think that you're hurting your son or your child, not just son, but you think you're hurting your child by spanking or using a switch or whatever you use. But by not disciplining him, you are setting him up for a much greater hurt later.
I also think just by being a homeschooling parent and like having to spend a lot of time with my children, you want to enjoy their company. And by not instilling discipline, you don't get to enjoy them as much because they run, they have the opportunity to run all over you. And I've seen that in parents who don't take the time to discipline a young child when they're little, and they can't stand their kids, And so I think having, I think our society now has a lot of ways to not have to spend a lot of time with their children. And, there's a natural desire as a parent when you're spending day in and day out with them to like get this under control because you're spending day in and day out with them. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, when parents don't when society has set it up where they're not spending a lot of time with their kids, there's kind of it's almost like a deferral of that responsibility. And then you got a teenager that's out of control and, and that is really difficult to get this thing under control. But you can control a child when they're younger and get that relationship of authority established, however that needs to happen, whether it's, one spanking or two or whatever it takes for that particular child. But I don't know. That's kind of one of the things I see in our society, the way we set it up is, a lot of kids spend a majority of their time away from their parents and trying to establish that that authority with them is much more of a challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
especially if who they're spending that other time with is actively undermining that authority.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and too, you have to realize, like, it's not just, the whole he who withholds the rod or discipline, whatever form that takes from the child. It's like what you're describing, Jenny, is, that person's going to like have weird emotional and psychological challenges to endure if they don't like their children. Like we're not meant to like not like our children. I think that there are moments that we can all, agree that we might not have appreciated our children, when we've been in certain circumstances. But I think ultimately this idea of like not liking your children, how painful is that?
Exactly. It's
like that's painful for you.
It's a deferral of responsibility, I think. Ultimately,
yeah.
It is kind of a way of like, I don't want to deal with this for whatever reason. And so you just keep deferring dealing with that, because you don't want to deal with it at the moment.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
I saw a meme on Facebook. I think it was on Facebook just this morning. It said that if you don't discipline and raise your own children right, I mean, if you do discipline and raise your own children right, you can spoil your grandkids. If you spoil your own children, you're going to have to discipline and raise your grandchildren.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there's plenty of people experiencing that right now. There's a lot of that happening right now, I think, in our society.
Yeah. And if you think about like even this in the context of us as God's children, there are ways in which he will put us in situations that discipline us when he needs to, because he loves us. And he is a good father. We can trust that he is a good father. So the fact that he does that with us, that he disciplines us. I mean, he doesn't spank us like physically, like I've never gotten, smacked by the hand of God, physically, but I certainly have been smacked by the hand of God in my life. And it came through, circumstances and, situations that he obviously allowed in my life. So we can also take confidence in this truth here in this proverb and apply that to God himself, because we know that is part of his behavior toward those he loves.
And we want that even though we don't want it.
I totally agree with that. I want it, but I don't want it. Like I want it, but please don't make it hurt so much. Yeah. But, I do have to say, like in my own life, and I think I said this the other day, it's like in my own life, I didn't have to get a lot of physical discipline, because I did get it early and I got it appropriately, in my life. I know, my parents weren't perfect, but I know that when they applied that, they applied it appropriately, because it wasn't like, abuse. It wasn't like somebody like angry and just like beating their children kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that's an important aspect of, I think, where our culture has gotten off about some of this stuff, is that we do have people who abuse the privilege of parenting and how to parent, don't know how to parent, whatever it is, and how to use these tools, whatever you want to call it. But
when I was growing up, you still got paddlings in school, and, corporal punishment was normal back then. And, but I just wonder how often this verse being taken out of context to back up someone's abusiveness got us to the point that we are now, where it's the other side of the extreme,
Yeah, I think that's probably was a big contributor to how we got here, right? Is a lot of people experiencing abuse by people who used maybe this verse to justify their actions, right? And that's, throughout history, we see people doing that kind of stuff. They use the scriptures to manipulate and support their behaviors and their own interpretations of what it's supposed to be like. And I mean, that's not a new thing. Even that's what the serpent in the garden did